You're watching Vision 2021, in which we talk to the leaders in business about the main activities, trends and strategies shaping commerce and the economy. This week we're dealing with the issue of business rescue in South Africa. For more on that, I'm joined by Dr. Levenstein, Head of Insolvency, Business Rescue and Restructuring at Werksmans. Thanks very much for joining us, Dr. Levenstein. First of all, briefly discuss the landscape of business rescue in South Africa since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you, Gary. Look, since COVID-19 hit our shores well over a year ago now, COVID relief funding was in place for distressed companies, and we saw a lot of fallout last year with a lot of companies being mothballed. Companies like South African Airways, Comet to an extent, and others in the retail industry. But looking at it where we are at the moment, I think that with the onset of a third wave, continued pressure on the economy and on companies, we're going to probably see more filings for business rescue. I think it's important for everyone to understand that prior to 2011, all we could do with companies that were failing or were distressed was to put them into liquidation, which is not a very good outcome for employees and obviously for the company itself. But since 2011, 10 years now, we've had our legislation. We are able to restructure companies, try and put them back on track and get them to contribute back into the South African economy. And the big advantages, of course, is when you appoint a practitioner, he or she can renegotiate with creditors, offer them maybe a better deal than they would get in a liquidation, potentially restructure contracts, and basically get the company back into a solvent position.
Obviously, this places a lot of pressure on directors of financially distressed companies and their options. What can they do?
Well, Gary, directors often are in panic mode when they hit financial distress. They don't know where to turn. Some of them don't get advice early enough, and they leave it too late. So business rescue is really there for the company that gets in early, where there's still value to be rescued, and where directors are brave enough to make the hard decision to decide whether or not to get an intervention like a business rescue practitioner in to assess whether or not this company can in fact be rescued. Now, often many companies are already too far gone. They should be placed into liquidation rather than, as they say, kick the can down the road. But there are companies which can take advantage of the business rescue process and obviously work together with the practitioner and allow his supervision to get the company into a better space. Now, directors often are faced with aggressive creditors, threats of liquidation, sheriffs are knocking on their door, writs of execution, which makes all of this very, very pressurized. So the decision to go into business rescue is one that should be done on an informed basis, and directors, I think, need to understand how the process works. If they don't understand how the process works, they will never embrace it. So it really is something quite daunting for directors.
What are some examples of companies that have been in distress recently or in the recent past?
So what we've seen is companies like South African Airways embracing business rescue, Comet, for example. If you go back into time, in the early days of business rescue, we had mining companies like South Gold Exploration, Basil Reed and Group 5 in the construction center. We've had Edcon, which have had a really good result in certain portions of their business being sold off to TFG, for example, and to Retailability, where those companies are still trading. And really what it does do, it creates opportunities for M&A transactions, for merger and acquisition transactions, where like we've recently seen Comet go through a process through business rescue and will hopefully very shortly exit with new investors having bought into the company, retaining a certain portion of the job market and allowing it to literally fly again into the future. Now, obviously, South African Airways, there's big news at the moment that a strategic equity partner has now been found. I think it's very important that people don't forget that that came out of a business rescue process, even though the strategic equity partner was only recently identified. But what it does do, it creates an opportunity for restructure of debt, for looking at third-party purchases and getting buy-in where a company can continue to trade forward on a successful basis and on a solvent basis, contributing towards the South African economy.
What are some of the, from this, Dr. Levenstein, what are some of the key lessons for state-owned enterprises in business rescue?
Well, state-owned enterprises is not something that happens every day. South African Airways was the first company that went into business rescue. I think the big difficulty for any business rescue practitioner appointed in a state-owned enterprise is that they are dealing with government as a shareholder, which obviously comes with its own political considerations and pressure. Now, of course, in South African Airways, it took quite a long time for Business Rescue Plan to, in fact, be published, but it was published in the end. It was approved by creditors voting in favor of the plan, and it did exit, as I said earlier on, with now the opportunity of strategic equity being a part of this restructuring. But I think the important lessons is, as we've seen in the courts, is how you deal with employees and trade unions. Now, often, business rescue plans can be scuppered to a large degree because trade unions and employees are not consulted, are not embraced by the practitioners, and where the business rescue plan needs to be approved by, I think, trade unions and employees to a large extent, A, before the plan is published, and B, before it's in fact put to the vote. So I think some of the lessons learned is keep your key stakeholders close, looking for a strategic equity partner. I think employees need to be involved in that process, as do creditors and stakeholders like shareholders, like government, which I think were obviously very much informed in the business rescue process of SAA.
What are the opportunities for investors looking at making acquisitions in companies which are in distress and in terms of business rescue processes?
Well, Gary, as I said earlier, transactions in rescue, in what we call distressed assets, is becoming quite prolific in South Africa. When you look at international jurisdictions, it's very much something that's on the high end of the agenda, where there are distressed funds investing in distressed assets. And I think for savvy investors who come along and see a distressed asset and it goes into rescue, you can certainly make a play for an asset, probably at heavily discounted values, where, for example, you might pay R1 for the shares and put something in for creditors better than they would get in a liquidation. And I think if investors understand, and let's say venture capital in particular, understand the opportunities offered by the business rescue practitioners, I think really good transactions can happen. And I think for the benefit of the South African economy. Now, we might see more SOEs going to rescue. We might see more of a private equity play or private strategic partners coming to the fore in SOEs. In the private sector, I think the jury is out in respect of future opportunities where business rescue can be used for really good acquisitions going forward.
Well, we're going to leave it there, but it sounds fascinating. Dr. Eric Levenstein, Head of Insolvency, Business Rescue and Restructuring at Werksmans. Thanks very much for joining us on Vision 2021.